I guess I will just get rolling. All right, so thanks everyone for coming today to our second professional development event, our first virtual one. My name's Cassia and I work as a range ecologist up here in the Caribou. And I have been extremely fortunate to have some wonderful teachers in my life who've shared their wisdom with me. And one piece that really stuck with me was how easy it is to identify grasses because you really only have to look at 4 parts, no matter what grass you're looking at. And I thought that was so unique. And I was hoping that that's the one little piece of info I can share with you all today. So in this workshop, I am mainly going to be working out of the Plants of Southern Interior of BC, the field guide. It's a great little book that I've adapted the key for this presentation. And if you're new to plant terminology and some of the terms are weird or you're not sure what to look at, Google is a great resource. But if not Google, I do recommend visual glossaries such as this plant identification terminology glossary here. That's the one I own and I like it very much. So quick disclaimer.
Cassia.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, can everyone see Cassia's screen? I'm not sure that I can.
No. Okay.
Have you shared it yet, Cassia?
No.
There we go. There was a second button. My apologies.
Perfect. We can see it now. I can see it now. Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that, folks. We are all new with this Zoom stuff, and yeah. All right. So, anyways, you missed that screen. Here's the pictures of the books, and here's my quick disclaimer. That while I am an employee of Flinnerod, I'm not speaking for the ministry. This is just an extra bit of fun that I am a nerd and decided I can do this. My aim is to make plant identification really simple. As such, I am going to oversimplify some things. You're going to find grasses that are a bit more complex out there in the real natural world. All the images are either a Google search or they're my own personal image. And when we get to the genuses and the tribes, I'm going to be doing my best to pronounce the Latin names, but it is Latin, so if you pronounce it differently, that's fine. Just pronounce it however you can remember it. I've talked about which books I'm going to be using, so yeah, I think that's all the disclaimers. All right, so the first step in identifying a grass is to make sure that we actually have a grass, because there's a lot of plants that look like grasses that aren't. So grasses have a hollow stem. You will also find nodes. These are joints along that central stem that kind of stand out. And the leaves come out in opposite rows along the stem. Whereas if you have a sedge, it's going to have a solid stem and it's going to feel triangular, kind of clunky when you roll it between your fingers. You won't have those nodes and the leaves are going to occur in threes. And you could also have a rush, which again has a solid stem. It won't have any distinct looking nodes, and the leaves are going to be lagging or not having the same features of the grass that we're going to be going over. And there's a cute little rhyme for those of you to help remember, and it goes like this. Sedges have edges and rushes are round, while grasses have nodes that are easily found. All right, just when you thought I couldn't get any nerdier, there I just keep going. So here are the parts of the grass that we are going to be covering today. I know this can look really intimidating, but I'm going to break it down into really small, easy, manageable chunks. And we're going to work through all of these terms together. The one that I kind of don't cover anywhere else, but here is the culm, which a culm is the central stem of the grass here, which I'll try and refer to as a central stem just to limit the amount of terminology that we're using. Okay, so the parts of the grass we're going to break up into 4 sections. We're going to go over the seed head or the inflorescence. Then we're going to cover the leaves, which are actually the leaf blade and the sheath where it covers that central stem. The collar, and this is where that blade of the leaf attaches to the sheath. There's a bunch of key details in this one little area. And finally, the roots and the crown. So we're going to take that entire grass and break it down into 4 sections. Starting at the top, we have the inflorescence, which is what a grass flower head is called. This, if you do have that inflorescence, it is by far the easiest way to identify grasses. Yes, you can identify them vegetatively. It just gets a lot trickier. So for today, we're just going to stick with using that inflorescence as our main key feature. In the inflorescence, the basic unit is called a spikelet. A spikelet is composed of 2 glooms. So we've got 2 papery bract structures here. These are glooms. And they're going to be at the base of every spikelet. Inside the spikelet, we're going to have the grass flower, which is called a floret. That's made of a lima and a palea. Think of these as like the petals of the grass flower, and they cover the reproductive structures, the ovaries, and the anthers. You might also see some additional features such as hairs, you can see over here, and awns. So for every grass spikelet, the first thing you want to do is find your glooms and then go in from there to figure out your florets. This is an example of one floret in a spikelet. We do also have grasses that have many florets in the spikelet. So again, the first thing we want to look for are those glooms. Those glooms are always going to be empty. They're always going to be at the base of your spikelet. So here on the left, you can see they're empty, and then on the right, you can see when they've cut this grass in half, how there's no reproductive structures in there. That's a key way to figure out your glooms from your lima. Inside these glooms, we can see those floret structures repeating. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 florets in one spikelet. The grasses in our area are going to have one of 3 types of combinations of florets and spikelets. We will either have just 1 floret in the spikelet, you will have 2 florets in the spikelet, or you will have many florets in the spikelet. Many is anywhere from 3 up. So it's not that complicated. Look for your blooms and then just kind of get in there, break it apart, and see how many florets you can find. We typically have just these 3 inflorescence types. Most commonly, you're only going to see the spike on the left or the panicle on the right. So a spike has each one of those spikelets attached directly to that central stem. You can see right where there's a node, there's a spikelet. A raceme is just one variation out where we have one branch in between that central stem and the spikelet. And then we go one variation further, we have a panicle. A panicle has a branch that connects to a branch that connects to the spikelet. Again, around here, we're pretty typically only going to see a spike or a panicle, so you just need to be able to tell if your spikelet is attached directly to that central stem or if it's branching. One more note that we need to look for on the inflorescence are how many spikelets there are per node. On the left here, you can see there's nodes, and here we have one node, we've got glooms on the bottom, and there's one spikelet per node. When we look on the right, these long narrow structures are the glooms, and you can see that there are one set of glooms here and one set of glooms here, so we have 2 glooms per node. So we have 2 spikelets per node. And here's an example of that panicle, where you can see that central stem with a branch taking off here and another branch leading you down to your spikelet. So that's pretty much it for the inflorescence. Make sure you can figure out the number of florets in each spikelet, so the number of flowers per that group of flowers. You'll either have one, two, or many, and then how those spikelets connect to that central stem. Are they connected directly in a spike? Is there one branch, or are there many branches in a panicle? If you are somewhere else and you see something crazy, it's probably still a grass. They get a lot more complex, but for us to keep it simple, we're just going to go with these combinations. I'm going to take a minute here and see if there are any questions.
I just want to point out for those who aren't familiar with Zoom, down at the bottom of your screen, if you sort of move your mouse around, there's some icons. Just click chat and you can post your questions in there, and I'll let Cassia know going forward. There's none right now, Cassia, though.
Fantastic, thanks. And I hope I'm not talking too fast. It happens when I'm nervous, which I am. All right, so our next section of the grass, we are looking at the leaves. So the leaves, there's the blade, and that's this part that sticks out from the plant. We're going to look when it's emerging, the various shapes the blade can take, the venation. We're going to look at the tips and some features on the edge, and then we're going to look at the sheath, and the sheath, just like the sheath of the sword, is wrapping around that central stem. This section is pretty self-explanatory. So when the leaf buds are first coming out, they are most typically either folded or rolled, which I don't think needs further explanation. If you are not sure, there's a lot of grass out there in the world. So if you are in the field looking, just break it in half and take a look at the cross section. The leaf blades, again, you're cutting it in half, looking at the cross section. In the plants of southern interior, the most common questions they have are, is the leaf blade flat, which is here, or rolled, which is kind of represented here by involute, or are just the edges rolled in. You do also have some that are folded. Again, that seems, the names seem pretty self-explanatory in this section. Still looking at that blade of the leaf, we're going to take a look at veins. So on the left, on both of these pictures, we have prominent venation. And you can see here there's just ridges where the veins are. And then on the right, we have a central midrib. So you have basically the blade of the grass is flat, except for one ridge. You could either see it on the top or on the bottom. And then when we're looking at the tip of the leaf, again, there's not a lot of variation. We typically see either it's long pointed or it's kind of bluntly cut off. So it looks very rounded and it kind of looks like scissors came and snipped it off. Or with a V-shaped folded leaf, you usually have a boat-shaped tip at the top here. And that very simply looks like the prow of a canoe, boat-shaped. Looking at the edges of the leaves, details to look for are, is it hairy? Are there glandular hairs, which just have those little dots at the bottom? Is it toothed? If you can't see the tooth, you might be able to feel it if you run your fingers over the edge of the blade of the grass, or if it has a bit of a thinner, papery margin. Also, when you're looking at the leaf blade, you should take a look if it's hairy on the top or on the bottom. Often there are details such as pubescence or hair that are brought up in the key. And then on the sheath itself, you want to take a look if it's hairy or smooth, or maybe just the margin has a fringe of hair, or if there is that, again, kind of paper-like margin on the outside. And the last part we're going to look for when we're looking at that sheath is how it is closed. So we either have an open sheath, which is, it can be overlapping or it can just be wide open like this, or you will have a fused or closed sheath, which looks kind of like a V-neck sweater, in my opinion. And a good way to tell the difference between these two is if you grab the blade of the leaf and pull it back away from that central stem. The open sheath will simply open along its where it's not fused, where a closed sheath you will actually have to rip and tear it through here. And again, don't worry, there's a lot of grass in the world. If you want to see this, grab some grass out there and just start pulling it apart and see if you can see if it opens nicely or if you actually have to tear the sheath. So we're already halfway through the parts of the grass. Do we have any questions?
No further questions, Kathia.
All right, this is also just a break so I can breathe.
You're doing great.
Thanks. All right, so now we're on to the collar area. Here we're going to take a look at the ligule, the auricle, and the collar. So the ligule is just this extra little outgrowth that comes where that leaf blade meets the leaf sheath. Typically comes in one of three forms, where it's membranous, so it looks like a thin membrane, or it's hairy, or it's just absent. In this area, having no feature is sometimes a big defining feature, so absent is always going to be one of our options. The next feature are auricles. So these are little extra appendages that kind of wrap around from the leaf blade. They are usually long and claw-like, or short and stubby, or again, just not there. And finally, the collar. This is where that blade is meeting that sheath, and this is on the outside of the leaf blade. So what you will see here it could be continuous, so just all the way around, or it could be divided by that midrib. It can be narrow and broad. Sometimes you can have hairs there. So there's a lot of different features that could possibly show up, or it could just be very indistinct. Again, that's just that absent form of it.
Cassie, there is one question. Why do auricles exist?
That's a good question. I am not exactly sure why auricles exist.
All right.
I'm not sure why any of this stuff exists, but it's cool and it's out there. Good question. Very philosophical. Okay. So we're going to move on to the bottom of the grass plant now. So we're going to talk about the roots and the crown, and I'm also going to kind of touch on the longevity of a plant, whether it's annual or perennial, and kind of some tricks to see here. So first off, a tiller is a new grass shoot. All the leaves are nested inside one another, very much like those Russian nesting dolls. So if you can imagine, each one of these little guys here is going to become its own grass shoot. All the leaves and all that seed head are all stuffed in there. So this is a crown. Crown is a group of tillers. Crowns are most often seen on bunch grasses. In this case, we have a native perennial bunch grass. You may not see crowns in turf grasses because they use a different method for reproduction. Here we can see that this plant, in my opinion, has evolved in a fire system where the best way to protect itself is to group together, so that way just the outside fringes get burnt, but all those inside new leaves are still protected by being insulated by being tight together. So this is a crown and those are tillers. And this is a good way to tell if you have a bunch grass, is it's simply bunched together, and it will have a lot of thick roots underneath there. It won't be easy to pull up, giving you the indication that this is a perennial. There's a lot of energy invested in this plant in the roots and in the leaves of the plant itself. So you can see bunch grasses in this wonderful diagram here come in a bunch, have long, deep roots. Some may or may not have rhizomes, as you can see up on the top right. And when we're comparing those to annual grasses, the not the very far right, because that's the bacteria crust. But the next one over are annual grasses. You can see there's not a lot of energy produced towards roots or towards the plant. All the energy for these annual grasses are just going to the seeds. So you won't see a lot of leaves from previous years. It'll be quite easy to pull these guys out of the ground, and they're just kind of going to look puny and wimpy compared to the other grasses. So if you're kind of wondering, well, how do I tell if it's an annual? Keep that in mind. Does it look like this plant has put a lot of effort into staying in this one place, or has it put a lot of effort into just making seeds? So along with seeds, grasses can also reproduce vegetatively. That's what they use rhizomes and stolons for. So a rhizome is actually an underground stem, which is why you'll see these little reduced leaves as you go along. And rhizomes will be under the ground. At each one of these nodes, you'll get a new tiller popping up here. So in rhizomatous species, you don't often see that crown feature because the tillers are spread out along the rhizome. And here we have an example of stolons. Stolons are technically above ground roots. You're not seeing any of those scale-like leaves. And at each one of the nodes, there's going to be a new set of tillers produced. So this is a vegetative reproductive method where instead of dropping down leaves in this relatively sandy, dry area where you might not have the right conditions for the seed to germinate, this plant can spread out and continue to grow by relying more on the mother plant than having to rely on very ephemeral conditions such as if there's enough water when that seed drops down. All right, in 20 minutes, we have covered the entirety of the grass plant. I'm hoping that's demystified this a bit. Any questions before we move on to how to use a key?
There's no more in the chat right now.
Okay. I've rehearsed a bunch, and this is probably the most talking I've done in the entire week, so might be losing my voice.
Someone said, oh, how I hate stolons and rhizomes while weeding.
Yes, stolons and rhizomes are a pain in the butt when you're weeding, but they are so satisfying when you can just grab a hold and like pull out the whole plant as you go.
And Corinne says, there's no questions because you're doing such a good job.
Thanks, guys.
Will this PowerPoint be available afterwards?
Yes, it's going to be posted on the BCIA website.
Great, thank you.
All right. Okay, so
there's one question that just come up. Are stolons, rhizomes important for classification? Sorry. Yeah, are stolons and rhizomes important for classification?
Yes, they definitely can be. It's a great way to figure out. Usually, if you have a bunch grass or a sod-forming grass, if you have a native grass or a introduced species, and when you're going through the field guide, it will often ask you if there are rhizomes or trying to find an example here. Can't find one. It's a key feature in a lot of the grasses where they have very prominent rhizomes. So you don't need it for every plant, but it is important if you do see them and need them. Oftentimes you do have to kind of dig up the plant a bit to get to answer that question. So sometimes you have to guess. Hope that answers your question. All right, so moving on with knowing the parts of the grass and using a key. So first things first, we're still going to make sure we have a grass because this forb can look like a grass, but as you'll see, there are no color features. It's got a solid stem and it's actually producing a white milky latex when you break it open. This sedge here, again, it has long linear leaves, has leaves in whorls of 3, and doesn't have any of those color features, and our seed head looks nothing like what we've seen from the grass. And finally, that brush Along the entire plant on the right, you see there's absolutely no nodes. That seed head does not look anything like what we've looked at for grasses, and this little extra structure up here is the leaf, and there's just the one sad little guy. So there's a good example of grass-like plants that are not grasses. So what exactly is a key? A key is simply sets of paired descriptions where you work through the pairs, choosing which option fits best to work down to get to a tribe or a genus or species. For this lone pine guide that I've developed, we're going to first go down to tribe, and then we're going to go down to genus. We don't actually have a key from genus into the species, so we're just going to take a look at the features and see which one fits best. So here is the overall key. There are some times where I've broken it down into smaller chunks because it gets a bit busy and confusing on the screen. For our first species, we're going to take a look here, and the first question is, do we have a spike or a panicle? If you'll remember from 20 minutes ago, a spike has these spikelets attached directly to that central stem with no branches in between. So this gives us a spike. And our next question is, do we have a single spike or do we have several one-sided spikes? Well, how do you know what a one-sided spike looks like until you see one? Here is a one-sided spike. So if you can imagine several of these along a plant, that does not look like what we have here. So we have a single spike, which takes us to the tribe Hordeae. The Hordeae tribe, we have an inflorescence that's just one spike, and the spikelets do not have stalks. Again, this is our plant here. So our next set of questions are, do we have a single spikelet at each node? So again, we're going to look at the glooms. Or do we have multiple spikelets at each node? So from earlier, you can see there are those multiple glooms there denoting multiple spikelets for each node. Not what we have. We have a solitary spikelet at each node. So we're going to go this way. Next question, is the flat of the spikelet facing the axis of the central stem, or is the narrow part of the spikelet facing the central stem? A little bit hard to tell in this picture. So let's compare again. So here we have glooms on the outside here, and these glooms make this the narrow part facing the central stem, where the wider part, if we've turned it 90 degrees, facing the central stem in our picture on the left. So the picture below is it's a ryegrass, and the species we have on the left here is a wheatgrass. So in the wheatgrass tribe, in our book, we only have 3 species. So we're just going to take a look at the individual plant and its features and see if we can put them towards one of those species. So we have that spike, single spikelet per node. We're not seeing any awns at the tips. There we have the auricle. We don't know why the auricles exist. They're just there. We have an open sheath. Our color is divided, and we have some hairs on the leaves. We don't have any ligule showing up, and we do have some veins on the blade of the leaf, and there we have that thick rhizome that everyone hates when you're weeding because it just spreads and it's very tough to pull up. So with those combination of features, looking in our book, that gives us quackgrass. Everyone's favorite, but it is very prevalent out there. It's easy to find, and which is why I chose it, because it's easy to identify. We're going to stick in the wheatgrass tribe. Here's our spikelet, our spike. I've removed some of the spikelets. You can see that it is a spike. They are attached directly to that central stem. And you can see here we actually do have some tips, some on tips on our florets. And we have multiple florets in the one spikelet. We have a bit of hair on the blade of the grass again. We have some hair on the sheath and an open sheath, but now our auricles are smaller and stubbier. And while we do have a rhizome, it's not that big, ugly, creeping rhizome. They're relatively small for being rhizomes. This is the main feature for this grass, which is crested wheatgrass. And just since we're here, we're going to stay with the wheatgrasses. Here's a much better example of showing that the flat side of that spikelet is facing that central stem. You can also see how far apart each of those spikelets are compared to that crested wheatgrass. This is very, very spread far apart. Our auricles are purple, and we have a bunch grass. As you can see here, there's no spreading rhizomes. This plant is contained very much in and of itself. Putting all those features together gives us blue bunch wheatgrass. So those are the 3 wheatgrasses in our field guide. And I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, some of the names have changed. So all of these wheatgrasses used to be under agropyron. When I first learned grasses, they were. Since then, there have been a few changes, but I do think it's useful to still learn tribes because you can learn those traits. And then once you have one of these names, you can Google search it and come up with what the most current name is to date. All right, moving on to our next species. Again, we're going to start off with that first question of, do we have a spike or a panicle? If we take a close look in here, we can see there's a branch leading to another branch, which gives us a panicle. From this picture, you can't really tell if you have one floret per spikelet or multiples. And I couldn't get a good picture, so here's a diagram. So we can see here that there's just this one floret in the spikelet. And that very quickly takes us all the way over to the bentgrass tribe. I am too excited to speak Latin. Sorry, guys. All right, so in our bentgrass tribe, we clearly have one floret per spikelet. Our next question in our key is this inflorescence cylindrical, spike-like, and are the blooms on, or are the inflorescence not spike-like? So looking at this picture, you might be thinking, oh, I don't know, that looks kind of spikish to me. When we compare this to what the plant that we're getting to with that set of questions, you can see clearly what we have is not a cylindrical spike-like plant. So we're not going that way. And again, this is hard to give over a presentation. It's much easier in person for you to feel if that lima is hard or not. So then we're going to have to look at the next set. Are the awns various, or are the awns short or none? So you'll have to take my word for it until you find this plant that the limas are not hard and the awns are short. I had to break that key up because it got really big and cumbersome. So here we have the limas are not hard and the awns are short. So our next set of questions regard the gloom and the lima and the length. So here we have the 2 glooms on this side, and here's the lima. So you can see that the lima is much shorter than the glooms. The glooms are greater than the lima, or lemma. Pronounce it however you want. That takes off that entire branch of questions. Our next pair is the lima with a tuft of stiff hairs at the base, or is the lima lacking those hairs, or are they just very short? Again, I don't have a better picture for you guys. These tiny grasses are hard to take pictures of, but all of this structure here on the very far left is a tuft of hairs. So that takes us down to calamagrostis. In our field guide, we only have 2 calamagrostises to choose from. So let's take a look at the rest of the features. All right, so we have a bit of a purple color on the glooms. There's a bit of an awn that pokes out here. We have that ligule being quite long, paperous, and then on the back of the collar, we see that there's quite a few hairs. And if you were out in the field, typically you might see this picture on the left, but since all the fires have gone through, you're maybe going to come across that picture on the right a bit more often where you're seeing more of the seed heads. So when we put all of these features together, we end up with pine grass. As there's only two, it's easy to show a comparison that the blue joint has much longer hairs compared to the pine grass, and also has a short little awn compared to that long awn that points out. All right, we're going to move on to our next species here. Again, do we have a spike or a panicle? Well, you can see the central stem with a branch leading to another branch, so we have a panicle. All right, do we have one floret per spikelet or two florets per spikelet? Take a closer look. Here we clearly see that there's just one floret in the spikelet. Takes us right back to the same bentgrass tribe. All right, this should all be pretty familiar. We've been over this once before. All right, so this is definitely not that cylindrical spike-like inflorescence. Okay, so if I had samples of these, if we were in person, I'd pass them around and everyone would be able to feel that these limas are very hard. Along with that very hard lima, the awns are also very long. You can see this one actually is even longer than the picture I've taken. So that takes us down the other path that we didn't go on last time. Continuing to look at the awns, our next question is the awn branched in threes or is the awn not branched in threes? Again, you're thinking, well, I don't know. I've never seen an awn branched in three. What does that look like? This is what it would look like, where your seed head comes up and that awn quite literally just branches into three different directions. That's not what we have here on our species on the left. We have just one bent awn. And that awn is very long and bent. So that gives us our answer to our next set of questions, which takes us into the stipa, the needle grasses. So in our needle grasses, in our book, we have 5 different species. So let's take a look at the rest of the features of this grass to see if we can pare that down to one of these features. All right, so that panicle for the inflorescence, that hard lima. Take a look at that long, long, twice bent awn. Our ligule is kind of small, membranous. We have no auricle, and we don't really have a well-defined collar. The leaves taper to a long point, but really it's this hard lima with that very long, twice bent and very stiff awn that tells us we have porcupine grass. You'll figure out if you have a needle grass right away if you're walking through it. You'll probably find them in your socks and it'll poke into you and it'll feel pretty much just like a needle. There are quite a few different species out there, so if you're not sure, take a look at the other features and see what you have. All right, on to our next species. We've got 3 to go, I believe. So here again, we have that beautiful example of a panicle. We have a branch leading to another branch, leading to the spikelet. It's an easy decision to go through. All right, so now how many florets per spikelet do we have? So again, take a look. These bottom 2 features, those are your glooms. So here we have 1, 2, 3 florets per spikelet. I can't spell. All right. So our next set of questions are, is the gloom longer or shorter than the floret? So if our gloom, can I draw? Our glooms are ending about here and about here, where the floret doesn't end until here. So that is pretty easy that the glooms are less than or shorter than the first floret. That takes us down to the fescue tribe. All right, so we're here in the fescue tribe. We have a plant that has a spikelet with 2 or more flowers, and our glooms are shorter than the first floret. Next thing we're wanting to look for are awns on the lima. So again, that lima is the outside shell of your floret. And you can see this long, long structure here. That's an awn. They're not always this long. We just happen to have one that has very long awns. This is the one part of the key that I'm really not a fan of because there are annuals in these species. So what I've done here is say that if you're sure you only have annuals, go for volupia. But if you're not sure that it could be an annual or it could be a perennial, go this route. This is what happens in keys when you're first learning. If you're not sure which direction to go, just make a note of it. Go down that path. When you get to the species, if it doesn't look how the plant in your hand looks, you've obviously made a wrong turn. Back up and see where you weren't sure, and then go down that second path. All right, so now do we have a crowded one-sided, or do we have spikelets crowded in a dense one-sided panicle, or are the spikelets not crowded and not in a one-sided panicle? That's kind of specific. What are they meaning? Well, this is what a crowded one-sided panicle looks like. It's definitely not what we have on the species on the left, so we're not going to go that way. All right, our next set of decisions are the spikelets small? Are the limas on from the tip? Or are the spikelets large and the limas are on from between 2 teeth? I tried to take a picture of the 2 teeth for you guys. I just don't have the camera quality, but there are 2 teeth here, and these are very large spikelets. So that takes us down to brome. All right, so the bromes in our book, we have 5 to choose from. So let's take a look at the rest of the features and see if we can put them together to give us a species. So here we have this panicle. This plant has put a lot of effort into producing seeds. It has long awns, multiple florets per spikelet. You can't see it, but this is quite a fuzzy little plant. If you could feel it, you could feel there's quite a bit of hairs on it. You can kind of see the hairs a bit better along the edges here. And this does have a closed sheath. It's just very deep. You can see it all the way running down, closes about here. The ligule is membranous, and again, there's a lot more hairs. And what you can't see is this plant was very easy to pull from the ground. It had very shallow roots, making me think this is an annual. And with the rest of those features, we go down to cheatgrass. So now we're going to stick in with the bromes. We're going to look at another species here. So again, we have a panicle. The leaves are very big and robust. There are no awns and no awns on the limas or on the glooms, but you can kind of see that 5-head tip there, the 2 teeth on the tip. So this is just another good indicator of the bromes. And there's no hairs on this. It's very, very smooth. The glooms are shorter than the first floret. Again, that clarifies that we are in brome. Same with this lovely V-neck here on the closed sheath. There's absolutely no hairs anywhere on this plant. Bit of a ligule. So that takes us to smooth brome. So those are two examples of some bromes. Sorry, neither one are native. I was using the ones I could very easily find, which are the kind of more invasive ones. And on to our last species here. Again, we have a panicle, nice wide open. Let's take a closer look at one spikelet. Here we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 florets per spikelet. Takes us this way. Are the glooms, how long are the glooms compared to the first floret? You can see that the gloom is here and the floret is this long, so the glooms are less than that first floret. So we're still in the fescue tribe. Our next set of questions, do we have limas with awns or without? No awns to be seen, so we're going with limas without awns. All right, so is this plant of saline habitat or not? If you're not sure if you have a saline habitat, you can always take a look at the next set of questions. And if you were in a saline habitat, the next set of questions are asking if you have male and female parts on separate plants or on separate flowers. If you were to pull this plant apart and take a look at it, you would see that there are stigmas and anthers coming out, so none of that fits. That on top of, if you didn't know that you weren't in a saline habitat, but we weren't in a saline habitat, we were actually in a parking lot when we pulled this one. So our next set of questions, are the spikelets usually small, limas with or without curly hair at the base, or are the spikelets large and limas with a tuft of straight hair at the base? You can kind of see it in the picture here, but there is curly hair at the base and these spikelets are really quite small. So we're in POA. So in POA, we have 7 different species to choose from in our book. So let's take a look at the rest of the features. All right, you can see here, this is a turf grass. Definitely has rhizomes spreading out. There's no crown. Here you can see those anthers and stigmas sticking out. When we're looking at the floret itself, it's quite contained. It's not overly elongated, which is one of the questions to get to some of the other species. And it does have that bit of curly hair at the base of the limas. And then when we're looking at the features of the grass itself, you can see here that the leaf is folded, becoming flat. You can kind of see the V-shape, sorry, the boat-shaped tip. We've got boat-shaped tip. We have a ligule present sometimes, only on the flowering heads, not on the vegetative structures. There's no auricles, and there is no real defined color. That leaf is very folded, which is also how you get that boat-shaped tip. And finally, you have these really aggressive creeping rhizomes again. So this is a turf grass, not a perennial, or sorry, not a native grass, not one of our bunch grasses, which takes us to Kentucky bluegrass. Most of these guys are perennials, so you'd see them more grouped together. They wouldn't have those crazy rhizomes going on. All right, so there we have it, the fast and dirty 8 grasses. Actually, I promised you 7 and threw in porcupine grass at the last minute because I wanted to show off a stipa. So I'm going to see if we can get over to the chat to see if there's any questions.
It looks like there's just one. Cassia, do you have a PDF with all these keys you'd be willing to share?
I do not have a PDF because I've actually pulled these keys from that Lone Pine Plants of Southern Interior. In my copy, it starts on page 308, and I have quite literally taken it word for word, which is why I'm citing it so often, because I don't want to get in trouble for not citing it. I have not reinvented the wheel.
All right. Another question. How do you identify plants that are not in bloom?
Vegetatively, very difficultly. No, in all honesty, you can identify plants without having them in bloom. You just have to look at those vegetative structures. So the leaves, the ligule, the auricle, the collar. It can be done. There are other keys. It's a bit trickier.
All right. What is your go-to key for non-native agronomic grasses?
Most of the keys have quite a few in them. My absolute favorite is from Alberta Olds College. They've created the common plants of the Western Rangelands, and volume 1 is grasses and grass lakes. And it was actually Stephen Tanis of the Tanis family that created that book that gave me that key piece of advice that only 4 pieces of the grass you need to look at to identify any one. If you're still struggling with the introduced species, then check out, I think it's the Forage Guide. They have a lot of introduced grasses in there as well. Sorry, I don't have that book in front of me to tell you the title.
Someone else is asking, have you ever seen or used this book, Field Guide to the Grasses of Oregon and Washington? Although it is focused on Oregon and Washington, it claims it's useful for BC as well.
I haven't, but it probably would be very useful. I have a beautiful book from Saskatchewan that has quite a few of the same species. Grasses are quite ubiquitous. They do spread over wide ranges. So if you have one that hits most of your species, they're probably the right species.
All right. Another question. Are there tricks to identifying hybrid species?
I guess the first would be, yes, there are tricks. You'd have to know if your grasses can hybridize. Most grasses can, especially your wheat grasses. They tend to mate within each other and get very complicated very quickly. I would say consider how much of your life you want to spend losing your mind on identifying plants. I've gotten past the phase where I need to be absolutely certain I know exactly what it is. If I can get it down to genus, I'm quite happy. And then if I get it down to species, I'm satisfied. Past that, I'm not a subspecies. I'm not a splitter. I am a lumper.
All right. That looks like that's all the questions for now. If anyone else has anything, drop it in the chat box or unmute yourself, I suppose. Thanks, Katya. That was awesome.
Thank you. I really enjoyed doing that. I'm hoping everyone understood me as I was talking quite fast. And again, this will be put up on the BCIA website. I think in its entirety. I don't know if I'll be sharing the PowerPoint or if it'll just be the recording. Oh, but it'll be there.
All right. Cassie, are you able to see this chat? There's tons of thank yous. That was excellent. So helpful.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming. If you have any other questions, let me know. If you are ever unsure of a grass, you can always send it to me if you're in the ministry. Oh yeah,
thanks,
the
Cassia
illustrated
and Emma.
The Illustrated Flora of British Columbia, Volume 7. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there.
Cassia, do you have your contact information? Are you willing to share that?
Yeah, it's cassia.james@gov.bc.ca. Can we go to the very start of this presentation? It's going to take a while to scroll.
I'll type it. I can type it in the chat box. Actually, that is what I can do. All right. I've just dropped Cassia's email in the chat box. if there's no other questions, Cassia, are we done?
Yep, that's all I've got.
Awesome. All right, thanks everyone.
Stop sharing.
Bye, Cassia.
Bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.